have Becca reach out and do this with you guys, because I think that a lot of times we don't get the way our faith and justice coincide, and we don't really get that connection, or we haven't been in my faith journey up until the last few years. So like Becca said, my name is Danielle. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, where I am currently, but I'm normally in Washington, D.C. I'm an attorney there. And in my spare time, I work with Mission Reconcile. It is a faith-based nonprofit. And we do work with single culture, single race churches to bring them together in communities to have conversations about race, racism, and what it means to do the Christian walk. We found that for every local governing body represented in America, there are over four churches in each community. And what we've also found is that a lot of churches don't get outside the walls of their churches to talk to people. And it's like, if we're the church and we're supposed to have the answers, or we're supposed to have this knowledge, what are we doing that we can't get outside our four walls and talk to people and help our community? Our communities are suffering, as we can turn on any television station and see they're suffering. And it's like, what are we supposed to be doing in this context? And I think that because we don't really talk about justice and equity and mercy, we forget that is what we've been empowered to do. So I'm really excited to work with Mission Reconcile and to work towards addressing some of these problems.
Thank you, Danielle. I want to thank Becca for putting this together and inviting me to come and speak. Good evening to everyone from all over the US. I'm sure we're from all different parts, and it's really nice to have technology where we can see each other, even if it's virtual. My name is Hurunnessa Fariad. I head the Outreach, Public Relations, and Interfaith Department at the All Dulles Area Muslim Society in Northern Virginia. That's also called the Adams Center. We're the second largest mosque in the United States and the largest one here in the DMV area. We serve over 25,000 American Muslims. We're very, the work that we do is quite different than a lot of the mosques that we see around the United States. And we become an example for a lot of the mosques. And so we take pride in the work that we're doing, especially in our interfaith work with people of different faith groups and tackling issues that are very prominent in our communities and working together towards striving peace, understanding, and bringing some kind of social change to those issues. I have a music background. I'm a trained vocalist. And so a few years ago, the Imam of the Masjid asked me to start a choir, and I looked at him like he was crazy, only because singing is not part of our prayer service. But because the Imam at our mosque is quite progressive, he said, well, you're going to start it. And if anyone gives you any slack, tell them to come to me. So far it's been 4 years and no one has given me any slack, because I make it a point to point to him, be like, you have a problem, go to the Imam. He's, our religious leader. And the kids, when we first started the choir, I thought it was just going to be them singing at some Muslim events, but 99.9% of our event invites are to either churches, synagogues, or places like the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the National Cathedral, different social advocacy events, bringing awareness to things that are going on in this country and in the world as well. And it's great for my kids to do interfaith work through music, because otherwise they would never be involved in learning about other people's faith, knowing what Sunday Mass is or knowing what Shabbat service is. They know it better than most adults now, because they've been to so many different places of worship. And I love that, the fact that they can grow up and one day say, I did that when I was young with my choir. That gives me hope. And we do a lot of youth choir work with other churches and synagogues as well. I also started my podcast in February. It's called Sister Act. It's between myself, a female pastor, and a female rabbi. We're 3 women of faith, American women here in the United States, talking about issues that relate to our life, our faith, and resilience that's built around that. And I started that because I felt that men are not giving women space. And because I was brought up in Queens, New York City, if you're not going to give me space, I'm going to make it myself. So I kind of pushed that envelope a bit with that. But I think it's important for women to see other women opening up that space. Even in the faith communities, we see a lot of the times it's always men talking. And I was kind of getting tired of that, especially when it was relating to issues around women. And so now we've been doing shows every week on Facebook Live and putting it on our podcast about just the social issues that have been going on the past few weeks, and bringing guest speakers and talking about what they're going through and how our faith actually addresses those issues, whether it's from the Muslim perspective, the Christian perspective, or the Jewish perspective. And, you know, all three of us are friends, and we, you know, jive really well. And it's a nice way of people to see that people of different faith might worship God differently and might practice differently, but we can still love and respect each other and work towards a better future for ourselves and our families.
Thank you both so much. So well said, Hurunnessa. So I'm curious, Danielle, how would you say that your faith in Jesus informs you to pursue anti-racism and racial reconciliation, both as an individual and in our society?
Good question, Becca. Thank you. I think not just reading the text, but also reading the culture that the text comes from. A lot of times in the Christian faith, we just take it word for word, and it doesn't mean anything for us. We don't put it in the historical context. We don't put it in the spiritual context, the geographical context, to be able to understand what's actually happening. And a couple years ago, when I really just started diving into scripture, it was really the minor prophets that really spoke out and just really grabbed my heart. We did a study, actually led a study on the minor prophets, all 12 of them, and each one is God chastising the people for the way they treated their neighbor. And it wasn't even it was in the country, the way they were treating people, but then also he was punishing other countries for the way they were treating Israel, and then also the way they were treating foreigners and the way they were just treating people. And it was because they had their own mechanism, their own laws. And they're like, the people are really, they're doing the things that they think they're supposed to do. And I remember it was actually my law school graduation. I'll never forget this. We're sitting there, we're about to, you know, hear our commencement speaker, and she speaks on Micah 6:8. And it is it's my life verse now because of that. And if you look at it, it goes, you know, what now, O people, what are you supposed to do? And he's like, the Lord has told you what to do. It's to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And you cannot do justice, you cannot do righteousness if you're oppressing your neighbor, if you're making laws that are intentionally hard to keep, and then also putting your brothers and sisters, your neighbors, at a disadvantage because you're in power to make the laws, and you're corrupt, and you're greedy, and you're taking more than you're giving out. Those are the things that just really encapsulated the heart of God for me. Of he created us, he wants us to live in harmony with one another, and he wants us to do right by one another. We can't say we love God if we're oppressing the people who are also the image of God, the people that we see every day. And that is one of the things that really informs the way I look at issues in the news. I'm come from a news background. Before I went to law school, I worked in a news organization. And so I was able to go to different events and interact with different people. And at the end of the day, most people just want to be able to be with their family love their kids, know their kids are going to have a good future, and they have the opportunity to do that. And if we're making laws that prevent them from getting health care, we're making laws that are even on the face, if it's color blind, but you're still having a discriminatory effect on people, that's not a good law. And so one of the things that I like to do is just like, how is this affecting people? Are we giving the advantage to people who have money, who have access, who have privilege? And what we all have a privilege somewhere or another, but are we discounting that privilege to say, well, everyone has this? And we can see that everyone doesn't. So my faith is really bound up, not just in that verse, but just if you look at the books of Isaiah, you look at Jeremiah, and we see what the people were doing, and we see the way God lashed out at them. And then you see Jesus coming saying, no, I came to fulfill all of this prophecies. I came to do this work. I came to make sure that my people were doing justice to one another. And you can't love me, you can't follow me if you're not loving my image that is in the people around you. So that is one way that my faith informs the way I go about talking about justice and interacting in a manner that is not just equality, but also infuses equity into that.
Thank you, Danielle.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle. So if you look back at the history of Islam, and even before our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, started receiving revelation in the area of what is now known as Mecca, the issue of justice was really not prevalent in the society as a whole. It was a tribal situation there between the people who lived in that area. So if you were part of the tribe, you had all the justice afforded to you. But if you were one of the enslaved, there was no justice for you. You actually didn't even count as human. Women didn't have that many rights either. Sometimes if a girl was born, they would bury her alive in the sand in the middle of the desert. So all these things were addressed once revelation started coming to our Prophet Muhammad, and justice being the backbone. If we even look at the people who were around the Prophet and people who lived in that area, they weren't white. They weren't white people. Like, the Quran didn't come as revelation to white people. They were people of color. But even then, they were still bringing the enslaved from Africa into their homes and treating them really horribly. And then verses of the Quran were being revealed in terms of justice and what the Prophet had to do and how he was going to relay this message to his followers. And then there's also hadiths, which are the traditions of our Prophet in terms of what he did and what he said, that are outside of the Quran, but they're complementary to the ideals and values that are in the Quran. There's one verse in the Quran in the chapter called Nisa, where God says that justice has to be established even if it's against yourself and your friends and your family. So if we just stop and think about what that means, it's huge, right? Like, imagine if you're a perpetrator of an injustice and God's saying, well, you got to stop and think what you're doing. Are you being just to the people around you? And if you're being unjust, you have to stop yourself. That justice that God talks about is first and foremost to yourself. That if you cannot give justice to the people around you, then you're just as bad as those people around you who are doing the same thing, but for some reason you yourself can't get yourself to say that I am being unjust. And your family member and your friends, sometimes our family members do crazy things and we hide it, or we don't want to get them in trouble, but we know they need to get in trouble because they did something bad. So we have to report those things, right? If a normal situation, if some of our family members commit a crime, we need to report them. We shouldn't be hiding them behind our doors because they're family. Justice has to be served regardless of who the perpetrator is and who the victim is, because all life is precious. And in our tradition, it doesn't matter what skin color you're made in. That's God's choice. But we are all made by God. And it doesn't matter what faith group you belong to either. As Muslims, we believe that the same God that created us created our Christians, brothers and sisters, our Jewish and Hindus, and everybody on this earth was created by that one God. And we all have different paths to him. There's also another saying of the tradition of our prophet, where he said that if you see injustice, the first thing you have to do is stop it with your hands. So you have to physically move yourself to go and stop that injustice. And if you can't do that, then you have to speak against that injustice. And then even if you can't speak against that injustice, you have to hate it in your heart. And hating it in your heart is the weakest of faith. So he's already setting out a way of us to move towards justice. You have to physically stop it. If you can't physically stop the injustice, you have to verbally stop it. And if you verbally can't stop it, you have to hate it in your heart. So imagine if you're put in a position where you see injustice going around and you can't do anything because you feel persecution or for whatever reason it's being stopped. You have to hate it in your heart, because when you don't hate it in your heart, you become part of the problem, right? Even in the smallest and the lowest form of faith, you have to hate it in your heart, because it's important you don't get lost in all that's going on there. When we think about the history of Muslims in the world and bringing that into light into the US, when I tell people that 1/3 of those enslaved that came to the United States were Muslim, people sometimes don't believe me or are in shock, and it's something new that they've learned, right? And these Muslims were forced to convert by their slave masters into Christianity mostly, and their identity, who they were and what they came with, was completely lost. Right? Some of them were outwardly Christian, but inwardly they were still Muslim. But some did convert. They had no choice. It was life or death, right? But that's another injustice that we've seen happen in this country. But again, history books don't teach these to us. I know growing up in Queens, New York City, I did not learn anything about Muslim slaves coming into this country from Africa, right? They were just saying they were enslaved, they were brought here, and this is what happened. But there's so much of erasing of the history of people who came to this country forcefully, unwillingly, in numbers that, I don't even think we probably have the right numbers either. But we have to be mindful of that all of our history is intertwined. And that when you seek justice, justice is not just for me. Justice is for everyone around. And when our Prophet Muhammad established the city, now it's called Medina, it used to be called Yathrib, justice was for everyone, regardless of whether they were the Christians or the people of the Jewish faith that were living in Medina with the Muslims. So if a Muslim was doing something unjust to someone who was Christian or Jewish, the ruling was that Christian had to be justice had to be given to that person, regardless of whether it was the perpetrator was Muslim or of any other faith, because justice is supposed to be blind to color, blind to faith. What's right is right. Don't ever steal someone's rights. And this is a huge factor in our faith. And even though Muslims are constantly told this in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, and even race being an issue, because our Prophet said that a white person is not superior over a black, and a black person is not superior over white, an Arab is not superior over non-Arab, and a non-Arab is not superior over an Arab. The only thing that measures your worth is your piety and your humility in front of God. God does not look at your skin color, because he made you, right? If he did not give you a choice to pick how you're going to look, how can you judge yourself? How can he judge you by something that he's made you in? And he says in the Quran that I've made you into nations and tribes so that you can learn from one another, right? He's made us different because that's the beauty. There's beauty in our differences. Imagine if we all looked the same, how boring would that be? And we all spoke the same language, right? We wouldn't get all the great different languages or the great foods that we eat. We'd all be eating the same thing, right? So all these things are part of the process of understanding where we fit within our faith. I remember, just talking to people recently about, especially within the Muslim community, about, race and what that means, and bringing justice into that conversation. And we have a lot to learn. Our community, because majority of them who are 40 and above are immigrants, they have no idea the 401 years of slave history in this country at all. History, so they can't really understand when we say things like racist policies that are embedded in the foundation of this country, how the system is rigged to, you know, make the Black community fail, that there's no way to move forward from what they've been given except going down. And, you know, I've heard conversations where people would say things like, well, you know, what's the big deal? They should just get up, go get a job and pay their bills and get an education. And then I have to explain to them, well, it's not that simple. If you give a white person that same strategy, it's easy for them to move around. But when you say that to a Black person, it's not easy, because the system is rigged where they actually can't move forward. They can't get to where someone who isn't Black can. And I had to like walk them through. And this is like individual conversations that I've been having for the past couple of weeks with people from my faith who have come to this country as immigrants. And sometimes it's frustrating because they don't understand what I'm trying to say. And so like, I'll refer them to books and say, you know, you really need to like learn the history behind what has happened, or refer them to someone who is from the Black community who can have this conversation with. But then when I get on Zoom calls and people from board members say things like, who happen to be from the India subcontinent, and they say things like, well, I'm brown and I don't have anyone who's racist against me. In fact, all my friends are white, and I even get contract work from white people, so they hire me. So there's no racism and there's no color issue in this country. And I was like, where do you live? And on top of that, this isn't about me as a Muslim or you as someone from India. In terms of what we're talking about, in terms of race and the Black community in this country, this is not about us. We're not in the place to speak about it. We are in a place to open up segues and give the Black community platforms and be allies and learn what that means, so that all the information that needs to go out is going out, so people like him can actually learn what that means. And I actually had to check him because he was not going to stop. He's like, there's no color issue in this country, because he, as a brown man from India, wasn't having racist people around him. And the point was completely lost, right? So our faith organizations are taking these things on. Now we're even talking to people within our own organizations at Adams, where we're trying to see how equity is being actually distributed between the board members, between the members who are coming, the employees, and how all of that actually plays into this dialogue that needs to happen.
That's so good. Yeah, I've definitely had some of those conversations with individuals who have said those things, and it's only when they've really taken the time to really sit and listen that they kind of get it. And I know we talked about this maybe a little bit earlier the last time we talked, but it's you know, when you come into this country as an immigrant, you don't get the full background, the whole story that a lot of us grow up here with. And unless you've taken the time to study, a lot of the stuff will go over your head. I think for me, I grew up in a particular, a bubble within a bubble within a bubble, if you will. Growing up in the Bible Belt, Deep South, went to a Christian school, a private Christian school. But I also grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, the birthplace of the civil rights movement. And it's only been like a few years before like I actually put together conversations that like my parents have had, and realizing that my parents were part of the first or second class of high schools that were integrated in the city. And had the high schools not integrated, they wouldn't have met. And so that's part of my history in this country, and just understanding that personal connection. And I think when it comes to faith, understanding that the way colonialism is wrapped up into this, and we let power structures and systems infiltrate the Christian faith for power, and it made it in a way that it was tainted and it's dirty. I mean, when we look at, I was having this conversation last night, that this is one of the first experiments where Christians are in charge, and Protestant Christians at that are in charge of a country and of a government. But America and its Protestantism only goes back 230, 40 years, give or take. And before that, you go back to England. And that's the connection there, that colonial empire spread, and using religion to spread its force on people. And so it's not just America. It's, you look at places, Australia, you're looking at a lot of, in that cultural context. And so with that, there are a lot of feelings there. And until you actually sit down and learn about the way my faith has done these things. And a lot of times people are like, well, I didn't do it. It was people who were, dead long before I was born. They did it. It's all them. That's not helpful, because we are the fruit of that. And while not individually, our faith, while co-opted, did some bad things. And to be able to understand and acknowledge that. What does that look like in 2020? We see the systemic nature of racism even in this pandemic. Before we were, we're looking at screens and we're scared of this disease. And then the numbers start rolling in about who is getting infected, who is dying. And yet we're seeing Black and brown communities, people of color, Indigenous people, suffering the brunt of this pandemic. And it's not because of physical attributes, it's because of the nature of systemic racism. And that's the way that, and so what does that mean? So we have a systemic nature, we have a deadly disease, and we have Black and Indigenous people of color dying. How do you put all of that together in a faith that's like, now we are somewhat removed from some of these structures, but it's like, it's here, it's still in our healthcare. And when we talk about what does that mean for my faith? How do I help? I'm not a nurse. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm voting for more healthcare access, health insurance? I don't know. But it also means having compassion, again, for the image of God. The image of God is in every person that we see, that we come in contact with. Even those people that we think those nasty thoughts about that we would never say out loud, even those people are the image of God. And I think that is what is indicative about our faith. It keeps going, we keep going, and yet we have to make room for justice. And so does that mean we pass more laws? Does that mean local ordinance? Does it mean we wear a mask? I think all of these questions, putting other people before us. And I think whatever privilege we have, we use that privilege to put someone before us. We use that privilege to think better of someone else than us, our rights. And I think for Christianity, and especially in this country, we have allowed our rights as an American to outweigh our rights and responsibilities as Christians. And we've got some reckoning to do. And I think that's what this really long time out is teaching us. We have some reckoning to do with our history. And yes, the 400 years predates America, but it is the foundation of what this country is built on. We have colonial laws that predate this country that made people property. Like, just that thought should trip us up. And when we think about, but it's my right to own It's our rights that get in the way of us actually living and doing justice. And very much what Hurunnessa said is us laying down some of those things to do justice to the image of God, to love mercy, to make sure that we are extending our privilege that he's given us to other people. And it's very much like, I like to think of it like a bridge. So if I'm extending my privilege here and you're extending your privilege here, then the whole world's covered. And that's just one of those things that I think that as a Christian in this country, we have the ability to cover our neighbors in prayer. We have the ability to cover them in protection. And I love it at all of these protests. I think that there's a little bit about why are people, like the conversation about why it's okay for people to go out and protest, but then people shouldn't be having, COVID parties. And I think that one of the things that makes me, we've been asked to go into this risk-based society now, whereas when we were at home, everything was shut down. We weren't making these risk-based assumptions. And so now that things are opening back up, no matter where we are, we're having to make risk-based decisions about what is safe and what is not. And it's very much in that frame that we have to make these about how we interact with one another and how we love one another. Are we loving people the best way we can? We can't love them if we're not doing justice to them, if we're not granting them justice and equal say, equal representation in courts, home equity, the ability to build wealth and equity and to be able to pass that on. Because I can look at you and say, I love you, but if you're still hungry when I leave you, if you're still thirsty when I leave you, that's not justice. That's not love. So that is, and I think that we have the power specifically in this country to cover all of that in ways that are practical and in ways that are still in line with our faith. And I think we've been taught that what we do and what we think are separate. And yet, I think that if we look at scripture, what we do is how we're judged in a way that is even more, is the thing that makes that decision a little bit more clear for us moving forwards. We've got to be doers of the word, not just people who talk about it.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you so much, Danielle and Hurunnessa. I love that. We can't be just sayers of the word. We have to be doers. And I do think that's the essence of our faith. So the last question is a bit of a stumper, but I'm sure you both have good answers. And I'm curious, how would you see the Christian community and the Muslim community working together to strive towards racial justice and reconciliation?
Good question. I think for a lot of people, there's a tension sometimes, and they're like, they don't believe what I believe. But do we believe the same thing that everyone else believes, even in our own households all the time? I think that, I think for me, we live in the same communities. People are still the image of God, regardless if they go to synagogue, mosque, church, or if they don't go at all. we are still the image of God. And I think that as a believer, that says more about me and how I treat people than it does about whether someone goes with me and does what I want them to do. And so I think that the ways that we work together is the same way we work together with literally anybody in our community. Muslims are our neighbors. And that shouldn't be some profound statement that you have to come to a Zoom call to hear. It's true. They're our neighbors. Jews are our neighbors. Indians are our neighbors. You know, Somalians are our neighbors. Like that, our neighbors are our neighbors. So when my neighbor eats, I'm happy. When my neighbor can read, I'm happy, because all of that ends up affecting me. And we're all part of a society that should want to work and build together to build a peaceful world together. So I think that, and I think also being intentional about it. I think sometimes people are like, oh, I'm a good person, but we don't necessarily want to go out of our way. And I'm bad about this even in general. I don't want to go out of my way because I'm like, oh, I'm running late, I'm running out of time. But sometimes stopping and sharing a smile, sharing a meal, something, going out of your way just to engage people, because you kind of never know what people are going through in general, regardless of their faith. And just sit down, talk, engage in conversations. Where is this person come from? What life experiences do they have that you could learn from? And what life experiences do you have that you would want to share? I think that sometimes we get caught up in labels, and it's like, let's just be humans. Let's be decent humans to one another. And I would love to, obviously engaging in more conversations like this, because a lot of times we are in our Christian silos, or a lot of times we are in our Muslim silos, and there's not a lot of opportunities to interact in a way that we can talk about our faith. Yes, it's different, but yet we're still the image of God. So there's commonality there. And we definitely have more in common than we have different. I want to hang out. I was like, give me your contact information. I want to hang out with Hurunnessa. Because I'm like, she's pretty awesome. Hearing her story and just learning more about her. I mean, granted, I also want to hang out with my grandmother these days, but Zoom calls is where it's at. So, but yeah, I think that like being intentional, I think that's how we grow our communities. That's the main way. And it doesn't happen out of good intentions or good thoughts. It happens out of action.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with everything Danielle said. And also adding to that, within the Muslim community, not knowing the history of what has happened, and then also having racism as an issue even amongst Muslims, because we are from all different backgrounds. We have white Muslims, we have black Muslims, we have everything in between. Even amongst them, there's racist, and racism amongst Muslims themselves, right? Like within the Arab culture, there are different types of Arabs, and they base it on skin color. So if you're a white Arab, you're a white Arab. If you're a black Arab, you're a black Arab. And am I going to say something to you? Am I going to allow my daughter to marry you because you're not the same skin tone? So there's that stuff that's embedded in the culture, not in the faith. And I make that distinction very clear, because a lot of people think that all these things are perpetuated by the faith, but it's actually culture. And these are things that were left from even pre-Islamic times, or things that have come in through colonialism, or this idea of the white color being like dominant, and has actually embedded itself in to places that are majority Muslim countries. But I implore them to please look at the issue. It has nothing to do with the faith. Faith actually is against looking at people in their skin color. You have to look at the person, who they are. Are they qualified to marry your daughter? Are they qualified to be the employee that you want at your place? Are they qualified to be a good friend in your companion and a companion for you, without looking at their skin color? All these things are perpetuated by cultural norms that have been indoctrinated into our society, but yet the faith speaks completely against it. So we're working on that fold, and then actually saying, well, now we have to work with people of other faith. And 99% of my job is I work with people of the Christian faith and the Jewish faith. That's my job. I don't really hang out with Muslims when it comes to my work. I hang out with Becca and we do things, and David and Laura, have traveled around the country meeting up with you guys. And one thing we all have in common is our love for God. And the three words that I always go back to when it comes to my relationship with people of other faith is acceptance, understanding, and respecting. And when we have these three words constantly in our mind, that I don't become less of a Muslim because I'm hanging out with Christians, and I don't become less of a Christian because I'm hanging out with a Muslim, is profound. That you yourself have this deep connection with God in your own way, in the way that you feel comfortable, does not get taken away because you're hanging out with people from different faith groups, right? You're actually learning more about them, and they're learning more about you. And at the end, what is it that you learn? I learned that my Christian friends are just like me. They like to eat pizza, go to the movie, and have a good laugh. Like I like to watch comedy shows, right? So we learn about the enormous amount of commonalities that we have, and our differences in faith is just one or two things. Becca, remember when we did the whole segment at Adams on Miriam, mother of Jesus? And the pastor at the end came and said, I didn't even know that there's a whole chapter titled Miriam in the Quran. For us as Muslims, Mary is the queen. She's going to be the queen in heaven. And he's like, I didn't know that. And like, he was like so proud of that. Like, he's like, yeah, it's in the Quran. I'm going to use that next time, and it's not even his faith, but he felt so connected to it because he understood the commonality of where we are and who we're dealing with, that even if it's something that's coming from another faith, he was able to own it. But it didn't make him any less of a Christian because he did. And all of our faith traditions teach us that we have to fight for humanity. That if you save one life, it's as if you saved all of humanity. If you take one life, it's as if you've taken all of humanity. It didn't say if you save one Muslim, you saved all of humanity, or if you took one Christian and that's it. Like, you're doomed and you're going to go to hell. It's about life in general for all of us, right? Even if the perpetrator is Muslim, I have to stand up against them. Even if the perpetrator is Christian, I have to stand up against them, and my Christian friends have to stand up against them, right? So let's take this instance with racism and what we're dealing with right now, right? It's incumbent on us as faith people to work together. We work together on so many other issues. This is just another thing that we're supposed to work together for, because our faith teaches us, like Danielle said, to love each other, to be there, to actually do things, right? I had this one girl who, and I'll tell you a story on Facebook. So I'm originally from Afghanistan. I came to the United States as a refugee in the early 80s after the Soviet invasion. And we started this Afghan Americans for Black Lives Matter. And this girl just wanted to change the name because she's like, I don't want to be called American. Although she lives here, it made no sense to me. And she's like, I don't want to be called American. I want it to be Afghan diaspora for Black Lives Matter. And then I disagreed with her. So she came after me. She started trolling me all over social media. It was really actually hilarious. And her whole thing was like, I'm going to tell you, she's like, oh, you're a suburbanite. You don't know anything. Now you just woke up. And so like, I could have told her all the work I've been doing and the equity committees that I'm on with different counties here, or the work I do with Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, but she wasn't looking for that. She just wanted to get her point across. So my thing was I had to listen to her and hear her out and not interject my own, feeling hurt by what she had to say. And what ended up happening, I had to end up blocking her just because she was getting a bit violent in her words, and I didn't really want to deal with that, right? But again, the idea is you want to do work, but what kind of work does that, what does that work mean? So I could even not work with people from my own faith group because they have this weird idea of how they want to go about this. But then I have my Christian friends who are like, yeah, we're going to do A, B, C, and D. What do you think? We're like, yeah, let's go, let's do it. So you have to find the people who are willing to work with you. And that's okay if it's someone from a different faith group. It should be like that. Actually, you should encourage that, because we can say that as people of faith, or even people of no faith, there's a common decency that God has made us with, or if you don't believe in God, that's innate in you. that always propels towards goodness. When we do good, we feel good. And when we do bad, we feel really bad. And we can all say that. Like, there's something inside of us that always says in our gut that what I did was wrong and I didn't stand up for justice.
Yeah,
And
that's so good. Oh, sorry.
no, I just wanted to add one thing to that. I think it's also understanding the history. Like, you kind of need to understand where people are coming from a little bit. And if you have no concept of the history and the background and the culture, it can definitely make things hard to have a conversation where it's coming from a place of understanding, acceptance, and respect. If, I'm not gonna go with bacon to hang out, with a bacon thing to hang out with Hurunnessa, it's probably not gonna happen. You have to kind of granted, I love bacon, so
I'll
but
let
after I
you
leave, yeah, you'll let me have the bacon. And so, but it's understanding, like being willing to like go and be uncomfortable. I think that even a lot of times we want to avoid uncomfortability. We want to be comfortable. We want to be safe. And I think to get to know someone, we have to step out on that ledge. I have a friend, and I think Becca knows her, and I was standing behind her in church one day, but I'd seen her a couple times, but I tapped her on the shoulder. I was like, you seem very cool. I just want to be friends with you. And that was what started a friendship. And it's one of those things, I think that it causes, we need to be a little bit uncomfortable. I know it's not for everyone. I would not take that approach with everyone. But I had seen her and I was like, oh, I think she could be cool. And it was just like, we sit on the same side on the same side of the aisle. And I was like, there's something about you. I'm attracted to you in a sense that I want to be friends. And we are still friends to this day. And it makes the friendship so much richer as I've gotten to know her and her background. And I think that that's another step that a lot of us could do in our communities. It's like, I want to be open to being uncomfortable and stepping in those moments to grow.